Video question. What do Egyptian understandings of the afterlife tell us about their world? Although we tend to think about mummies and pyramids when we think of the Egyptians, the actual process around mummifying and burying them can tell us more about their culture. Egyptian burial practice and customs are a rich source of information about ancient Egyptian culture. We can learn from them in three ways. We can learn by looking at the practices themselves and how they define their religion and cosmology. We can learn from the funerary inscriptions and wisdom literature, and that will provide us with insights into their culture. And we can learn about their moral requirements that were indicated in the Book of the Dead in Mott. So first, we can learn from their burial practices. So in ancient Egypt, their burial practices started very simply. It started by just burying people in round graves. They were basically holes. And people, they were just buried right in the sand, usually with a few objects. One reoccurring object seems to be a singular pot. But people were typically just buried here in the fetal position. Besides that, we don't really know much about their practices at this time. But as time goes on, the objects they were buried with start to increase in numbers, and they go from round to rectangular graves. We also start to see a variation in the quality of the objects they were buried with, which can kind of point to the emergence of social classes, as well as perhaps indication of gender-specific graves, such as some graves with weapons versus some graves with cosmetics. But approximately by the time of the First Dynasty, we start to see mastambas, or early pyramids. They're kind of like rectangular flat brick buildings that would be put on top of a grave. So they were kind of like early pyramids. Like I said, they're small and blocky, and they usually had false doors to let the spirit come out of the grave when they died. So in this time, we can learn from kind of like the practices, not just the graves, but the practices around them. So embalmers are one key player in this issue. So embalmers were people who would, like prepare the body for burial, and they were very important. Many times, people would actually like shop around, and they would have like versions, like different embalming processes that you could see and choose between. Or as Herodotus says, quote, "The embalmers, when a body is brought to them, produce specimen models in wood, painted to resemble nature, and graded in quality," end quote. So that just shows that it was really kind of like a thriving, it was like a business kind of very similar to today, where they would have like, models and stuff, and you could pick which one you wanted your dead relative to be buried in, I guess you could say. So the idea that was that, and this is a very old Egyptian idea, that the better you preserve the body, the easier it is for them to reach the afterlife. And so they would do all sorts of processes to the body before the burial. So if you were very rich, this is kind of the very best process. They would pull your brain out through your nose with an iron hook. Then they would cut open your back, and they would basically scoop everything out. They would take out all the organs and stuff, and then they would clean it out. And then they would put in many spices and palm wine and many aromas and things like that. And then they would sew it back up and soak it in natron for 70 days. And then they would wrap it in linen smeared with gum, which was kind of used as a glue. And then it would be returned to the family. A more cheap, kind of a more middle-class version of this would just be, instead of removing the organs, they would fill the body with cedar oil, then plug it up and pickle it in natron for 30 days. Then afterwards, they would drain out the oil along with the organs, which at that point would be liquefied. And then they would return it to the family. An even cheaper way would be to clean the intestines with a purge and then just soak it in natron and return it to the family right away. So those are kind of some of the processes they used. So to point 2 is the mortality. We can learn a lot about their ideas around mortality and funerary scriptions and stuff like that. So, I'm sorry, morality, not mortality. So we tend to think about universal morality in our days, like certain things that everyone agrees are bad and everyone agrees are good. A lot of this kind of stems from like the 10 Commandments and just very basic foundational ideas of, this is right, this is wrong, this is unfair. But they didn't really have that, I suppose, in Egypt. There wasn't exactly like a universal morality guide like there was in the 10 Commandments. But we can learn like some of their ideas around morality from their wisdom literature or tomb inscriptions. It seems that like instead of a guide, they had more of literature that that told about a very high standard that very few people reached. So instead of having like basic ideas like don't steal, don't kill, they had more of like very high ideals that were just that, ideals, and that very few people may have actually reached, but it was more of a goal and less of a guide through life. So one of the things that would help them with their morality and things after death would be the Book of the Dead. So the Book of the Dead also tells us a lot about their cosmology and their religion. So it tells us about the soul. So there are 3 types of souls. There's the Ka. This is like the most standard type of soul that you would think of. It was essentially the person's life force, and it was separated from their body at death. And there were many, all the burial practices where you preserve the body were essentially to ensure that the Ka had a home when it came back to the body, which it would do every night after, when the sun goes down. This is also why they would often do like, they would put a mask that would look like the person when they were alive. This would help the Ka identify the right body, because it was thought that if it didn't look like you, the Ka wouldn't be able to find you, and it may not return to the body at night. The second body, the second type of soul would be the Ba. The Ba was always depicted as a bird with the head of a man, and so the Ba would be like inscribed on the tomb in hieroglyphics, and that's kind of where it stayed. And it was the idea that it was a part of the soul that traveled between the land of the living and the land of the dead. The last type was called the Ak, and this was a little different. This one mingled, or was the type that lived with the gods. It survives through death, and it just kind of gets to hang out in heaven or with the gods, wherever they are. And this was the type that not everyone had, so only people who were good and who were worthy, who achieved it, would get to have one of these, and that would be with the gods. So there are many things here that we learn from their wisdom literature, such as what they thought about life after death and morality. As Taahotep says, quote, "Wisdom is more difficult to find than emeralds," end quote. Point 3, Mat. So Mat, what is Mat? It's very similar to, it's kind of like a societal structure in a way. It's, more specifically, it's the cosmic and social hierarchy of the universe set up by the gods. So it's kind of like a role you're designed to play in your life, and it's also strongly linked to like morality and getting into heaven or the afterlife and things like that. So one way we can kind of learn about this is the story of Sinu. He was, this is much like the story of Jonah from the Bible. Sinu was a servant in the palace, and he overheard a plot to kill the pharaoh. He was very scared of like getting caught up in this this plot and stuff like that. So he fled to Syria, and he raised a family there. I believe there were gods who were angry at him and stuff, so it wasn't a good situation. But he very much missed Egypt, and he wanted to return, and he wanted to be buried there. Thankfully, the Pharaoh, who was a different Pharaoh now at the time, pardoned him and allowed him to return. So this kind of shows the role of like the Pharaoh, the king in the society. So the Pharaoh was seen as like a god, and kind of part of their role was to uphold Ma'at and to make sure people were in a good standing with the gods. So that's kind of what the Pharaoh did in this story. And because in this story the gods were angry, and it's his job to kind of like keep everyone in a proper place by making sure everyone is okay with each other. And it is okay. So they thought in their time that at the end of your life you would be judged on how well you upheld Ma'at. So in a way, since the Pharaoh was in charge of keeping Ma'at and making sure that everyone followed it, whether or not you would, your eternal judgment in many ways was dependent on the Pharaoh and on the king. They also had this interesting idea that morality was more like corporate than individual. So it was more like group. It was more like a group effort. So that if society was in some sort of uprising or some sort of issues where they were breaking Ma'at or anything like that, it would kind of be the fault of the king, or the gods were angry or something like that. So these were kind of the ideas. Over time, it kind of changed, Ma'at did, and the Egyptians started to think that So they believed, unlike us, where we believe as Christians in total depravity, where humans are inherently sinful and will do wrong things. They believed it was actually possible to lead a life free of wrongdoings, or as they said, isfet. So they believed that this would also determine not only what happened after death, but this would also help them in life. So that adherence to Ma'at would generally, as a principle, lead to success, and aversion to Ma'at would generally lead to failure. But obviously this isn't always true. So when it didn't happen, the idea was kind of that no matter what happened in life, as a general principle, in the end, everyone would be judged for whether or not they upheld Ma'at. So that was, even if it wasn't like perfectly in life, it would always be final in death. So, but as time went on, they kind of lost this. They kind of lost this idea a little bit, or a change, I should say, and they started to see whether or not you succeed or fail as kind of left up to the gods, who were fickle and stuff. And in a way, this kind of led to responsibility being absolved, because like the future was kind of out of your hands. So that gets a little iffy, because when the gods are in charge, it's like, basically everything that happens is them. So people are kind of absolved of responsibility. But there are some writings that suggest that they still believed in Ma'at in that time, but they thought that it was up to the gods. So in a way, Ma'at was still there. It was just being changed, kind of, or the gods were kind of controlling it. So it was first kind of the Pharaoh's job to uphold Ma'at, or as Joshua J. Mark says, quote, the king's primary duty was to uphold Ma'at and maintain balance between the people and their gods, end quote. And then it evolved, and later on it was seen more as the gods who were kind of controlling Ma'at and controlling people's destinies. So although we tend to think about mummies and pyramids when we think of the Egyptians, the actual process around mummifying and burying them tell us much more about them. Egyptian burial practice and customs are a rich source of information about Egyptian culture. We can learn from their burial practices that emerged and that were defined by their religion and cosmology. We can also learn from their funerary inscriptions and wisdom literature that provide us with insight into their culture and morality. And finally, we can learn from the moral requirements indicated in the Book of the Dead that were built upon Mott. Thank you.